for you that lasts for 2 years. We will set up a day for the end of August, so we have a lot of time. Of course, you can deliver it way earlier if you want. Basically, we have 8 months to do it, so it's a lot. First, you can submit before, right? We avoid this with sessions after sessions after sessions after sessions after sessions, because then it becomes a bit difficult to manage. When it's 1 or 2 in 3 years, when we are not here anymore, it's colleagues that didn't do the class that have to look for all their exams or lectures where we are actually not really acknowledged about. And also becomes a real way, I think, to have to do with projects in a more tangible way. Good, but nevertheless, we will have a more precise session on the 8th with all of this. I don't know if you want to use the microphone.
I don't know. Can you hear me well also on the back rows? Yeah, then if you don't hear, please let me know.
All right, then I'm really happy to host Riccardo Villa today for the last session of 2024. The title of the lecture is Typing to the Universal on the Involutive Nature of Architecture. It's going to be about the garden, the temple, spaces that are able to make noise in a certain sense. Just a brief introduction. Riccardo Villa is an architect graduated from Politecnico di Milan. Also, he earned his PhD in 2023.
22.
22, wow, time flies.
Yeah.
Here at HTTP in Turin. He's also visiting scholar at ETH in Zurich. He's editor of a journal called Convidia. His work has been published around different magazines, one among others, Gizmo, that is an online magazine in Politecnico di Milano. As you will see, I think it's a beautiful way, this lecture. I know a bit Riccardo's work, so I can kind of project what he's going to do.
Let's see.
I think it's a beautiful way to finish our let's say, yearly session of 2024 session of lectures, because on one side, I'm pretty sure it's going to be a condensation of many things that we encountered with different lectures and doing different communications. But also out of this condensation, a screening out. So in a certain sense, also for the exam, let's say, giving you a certain kind of points in the cloud that you can grasp. Okay. So once again, thank you to be here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lorenzo, and thanks for the invitation. Actually, so the lecture today, I tried to address what you were somehow asking us to reflect upon. So this idea of type as something that perhaps can express an invariance, this idea to it that is dear to you of an universal architecture, and yeah, also this, let's say, provocation from Cacciari's phrase of the fact that one cannot inhabit the apeiron. So I will come on these points, I think, in my presentation. And as you said, I will try to use these three places, these 3 figures: the one of the studio, the temple, and the garden. Yeah, and for me it's quite a bit. So I didn't really work on the notion of type. So it was a bit a kind of a discovery and a journey. So also to a certain extent it's quite experimental. So perhaps let's see together how it will go. And I would like to start with a book that actually challenges the notion of type and of typology. So the one of OMA and Rem Koolhaas with Bruce Mao, SML XL, I think published in '95, if I'm not mistaken. And challenges the notion of typologies precisely because why most of architects, and still today, most architects would perhaps classify their work precisely according to typology. So now if you want to go to on a website of an architect, you usually have residential, offices, theaters, cinema. So the notion of type and of typology is still a way to classify one's architect work. Koolhaas adopts a very different canon. So it adopts a canon which comes perhaps more from fashion, no? The sizes of clothing, small, medium, large, extra large, and sorts the projects not by type, but by size. The interesting thing of this book is, as we will see, is that size becomes also a scale on its own. So it's not just a matter of resizing things or of expanding or contracting, but each by creating this kind of discretization in these 4 different orders, we could perhaps call them, then all of these different 4 different sizes have an autonomy and a quality on their own. But let's perhaps frame, let's say, the intellectual context in which this book emerges. So this book comes a couple of years later after the publication of books such as The Variations of Identity Type in Architecture from Carlos Martí Ariz, a Spanish scholar who wrote also other very interesting book that I recommend you to go and look at, like Eloquent Silences and so on. But Martí Ariz's books is interesting here because he's perhaps the last keystone in the history, so to say, of architectural theories that engaged with the notion of type and of typology. So Martí Ariz's book collects the legacy of what Anthony Widler in 1977 described as the third typology. And the third typology meaning that the first being the one of the Enlightenment, so Quatre-Mers de Quincy and D'Aubert-Lauger, so in which typology was used as a way to give an ontological foundation to architecture within nature, so a kind of derivation of architecture from nature itself. The second one being the one of the modern movement, with the reference of the nature, again, ontological foundation, but with the nature of the machine instead. So if you know, for instance, Le Corbusier, towards an architecture, there's always this correspondence and these analogies between architecture and the car, so the Pantheon and the car, for instance, and the invention of the automobile. And the third one, so this third typology that perhaps Widler is most, Martí Ariz is most keen to, is the one of the so-called rationalists, or the Italian rationalists, such as Aldo Rossi, Giorgio Grassi, and so on, that instead of referring instead of, let's say, founding architecture in nature or in the nature of the machine, refer type to a foundation of architecture within architectural form itself. This is, let's say, in a very short line what Widler essays on the third typology explains. And perhaps the most telling testimony of this connection between what I was calling a certain rationalism and the notion of type is the book by Giorgio Grassi, which is called La costruzione logica dell'architettura. I have appeared in 1967. It's never been translated, but we could translate it as the logical construction of architecture. And in this book, architecture is proposed as architecture and its construction are understood as a kind of procedure that follows a logical order of choices. So this order is expressed and investigated through type. So type is the, let's say, is the key concept through which this logical order is investigation. So it's a way, if you want, to discretize and consciously limit the field of study and the analytical spectrum through which architecture can be investigated historically and also built. So a logical construction that calls for an analytical foundation, one that looks at types in history, and a link to a rationalism that is something understood, and to actually in Giorgio Grassi's interest is actually not just any rationalism, but the German rationalism of a certain era, which is something that stems from what he calls an anxiety for certitude. So the aim of the logical construction of architecture and this kind of analytical foundation of architecture is to reach what Grassi calls a criteria of certitude and general constants in architecture. So already we see this kind of idea, this kind of aim towards what before I was referring to an invariance. So here the invariance is looked as something which could be general constant. So type as a general constant in architecture. So the aim is being able to design and build architecture based on choices that are not arbitrary, but they are logical. So a bit like we are able to write, for instance, only after we learn how to read. So there is a relationship with, if you want, also again, between architecture and language, so between architecture and a certain kind of logos, if you want, in which language becomes a logical construction. So this language of architecture becomes a logical construction. This is important, I think, in the work of Grassi, on the one hand, because Grassi teaches, so it's the idea of how to teach architecture in a way in which is not, let's say, the archistar or the creative masters that cannot can only be himself, but it's something that can be let's say shared as beyond personality. And there, if you want, there is also a kind of connection with a certain if you want, Marxist background of this discourse, which precisely connects architecture and production not as something which can be the property of someone, but as something that can be let's say alienated and shared between in this sense master and student. And this is a bit of provocation if you want, but perhaps I wonder if this notion of type couldn't be seen, again, as I was saying, with language as a kind of, again, a pedagogical instrument, a bit like we see this kind of calligrams, no? And this is interesting, I think, because this kind of illustrated dictionaries that we have for children do not try to explain what an apple is by trying to as a normal dictionary, trying to tell you what the meaning of an apple is, but they kind of point to a kind of relation between figure and type. So type in this sense, the types or the characters that are typed, in which the figure can be something that keeps on changing, and then the word or the types that compose the word are something that try to fix an invariance within it. So this is a bit, let's say, something which does not belong to Grassi, but as a bit a way to read perhaps this notion of time. But also saying this is what, let's say, the key that I would like to propose today is precisely not the one of type and typology in the discourse that pertains to it, but one that somehow tries to abstract from it, or tries even to a certain extent to counter it. So SML-XL, as I was saying, this is pages from the book SML-XL. So a classification of architectural data, so to say, that does not follow type or typology, but size or even better scale. And in this context, perhaps the bigness or problem of large is a manifesto for this approach. So in the first pages of this essay, which become quite popular amongst the other works of Colas. So it says bigness. What is bigness? So it says beyond a certain scale, architecture acquires the properties of bigness. So scale is not just a continuous, again, so something about scaling, so enlarging or shrinking, but it's something that it's also can be in its discretization acquires its own autonomy. It acquires its own property. And here you see also how the notion of certitude is, or certainty is somehow understood in a different way from the one that I was proposing before with the rationalism. No? So the rationalism is an anxiety of certitude or constants. Here is something that can be, that from a constant is translated rather to a threshold that can only be measured only if we could think of all the examples, so all the variations through which it manifests itself. So this idea of beyond a certain scale, we cannot say beyond, it's not beyond 5 or 6, so it's not, cannot be measured, but we can only grasp it only if we could make a summation of all the examples in which this scale is exceeded, no? So this idea of constant is already losing its power, if you want. So you cannot really have a constant, but it's more a kind of quantum which is there. So bigness is something that does not have properties in itself. It has rather a mechanics, a way in which it works, but that instead is able to provide properties. No, so it is a kind of difference. And bigness does not translate, if you want, into a classification of typologies precisely because of this, but in what perhaps Colas calls then the typical plan. So this is another essay that is extracted from SML-XL. So type not as a way to classify, to differentiate between different typologies, but a kind of category in itself. So it's not about type or typology, but about typicality. The typical plan, Colas says, is what he calls a zero-degree architecture stripped of all traces of uniqueness and of specificity. So if type and typology, if you want, seek to distinguish the specificity within the history of architecture, so to make, for example, the difference between a church with a cross plan or an amphitheater from a theater. So all this kind of distinction and different species, if you want, of architecture, the typical plan is precisely the inverse. So it abandons any kind of characterization and distinction. The typical plan, and here I quote from the text, Colas writes, is the end of architectural history, which is nothing but a hysterical fetishization of the atypical plan. No, so, and here I think Colas is precisely referring to history in this kind of idea of type and typology, the fetishization of the atypical plan. So of all these differences and the cultivation of all these differences. So the typical plan, if you want, implies a movement towards a certain uniformity, perhaps a universality or genericity. This has to be seen. So a typicality, and is therefore an indifferent, de-differentiated plan. So it counters this movement of differentiation. It reduces this differentiation to the minimum, to what Colas calls the 0 degree. And perhaps, Colas is not firstly an architect, but is a writer. Perhaps the not so hidden reference is precisely to the literary scholar Roland Barthes, and once again, not to language, but to writing. So this idea of a 0 degree of writing. And which, let's say, this book is more a complaint, is a bit, goes in a different direction. So it's more a complaint for the reduction of writing to a 0 degree, and a hope for this to then be the springing board for a novel and utopian and universal language. So an affirmation of something that can be positively a universal language. But however, the idea of Colas is a bit different, because the typical plan affirms universality not as a place, not as an utopia, not as something that can be conquered, but as he calls it, a condition. So he says the center is no longer unique, but universal, no longer a place, but a condition. So anywhere can be a center, if you want, in the word of the typical plan, and all of these centers can be universalized. And not because nowhere is more special than elsewhere, rather because any typical plan can be potentially special. So it can acquire specificity precisely because it has 0. So it's not that it doesn't have specificity and it remains like this, but it can still, in potency, acquire specificity. How does it so? So first of all, the notion of emptiness. Typical plan, Colas writes, is as empty as possible. And here I put all the pages from the typical plans essay. So you see there's a kind of lineup of typical plans, except for the last ones, which are the European interpretation of the typical plan. So what Colas calls the attempt to render the typical plan atypical. No, there's Mies, Leonidov, and Archizoom. But it says the typical plan is as empty as possible. And how does this, let's say, emptying, avoiding out work? He says because it excludes the primitive aspects. So he says that spaces such as restrooms, urinals, pantries, service stairs, tracking bears, so the sanctuaries for primitive aspects, are the ones that are excluded, so that the correct unfolding of business can depend. The other way is through depth. So typical plan, Colas writes, is deep. It has evolved beyond the naive humanist assumption that contact with the exterior so-called reality is a necessary condition for human happiness. And in the ever-increasing dimension from skin to core, the hidden potential of depth, it proclaims the superiority of the artificial to the real. So this is also interesting, is a kind of superiority of the artificial to the real. Another way is repetition. So the typical plan implies a repetition. It is at the end plan to be typical, there must be many. So this is, if you want, also the way in which the typical plan connects to the skyscraper. And indeterminacy. So to be typical, it must be sufficiently undefined, again, to this idea of not trying to achieve definition of determination or difference. And an indeterminacy which is achieved through a suspension of choice. So he writes, architecture is monstrous in the way in which each choice leads to the reduction of possibility, It implies a regime of either or decision, often claustrophobic, even for the architects. All other architect preempts the future. Instead, on the contrary, a typical plan, by making no choices, postpone it, keep it open forever. So it's a kind of open plan in that sense. And the typical plan is not, again, specific, except perhaps for its program, which is the one of business, of offices, clearly. And here is interesting because when Kolas asks what is business, he says supposedly is the most circumscribed of the program. It is actually the most formless. So there is a resonance between this kind of indeterminacy of the typical plan and its program or its function, the one of business, which is formless in itself. And he asks, could the office building be the most radical typologies, a kind of reverse type defined by all the qualities it does not have? As the major new program of the modern age, its effect is the one of deprogramming. So it's a program which deprograms things. So again, this relation, this double movement between specificity and genericity, or specificity and despecification, or differentiation and de-differentiation. The office building, he writes, represents the first totally abstract program. It does not demand a particular architecture. Its only function is to let its occupant exist. You can only be in the typical plan, not eat, sleep, make love. So a program which in itself is not specific, I can instead overwrite other programs. And here I think it's interesting not to go a bit beyond even Kolas, which will talk about building, but on the idea that this program of business and of the typical plan, or what embodies this kind of let's say, if you want, universality of the typical plan, is able to move to other program, also such as housing. No? So this is since we are having this lecture in the context of the Department of Housing, is also interesting to go there. And this is not a project from Kolas, but from Dogma, so the project for a communal villa, which precisely problematizes this aspect. So this coincidence between living, if you want, and working. So this kind of idea that being and of existing has to be related with production, and how do we, let's say, as architects, find a way to accommodate this. And it's interesting because the project by Dogma works precisely on what's on this exclusion and absorption of primitive aspects in order to empty out the space to make room for indeterminacy and typicality. So you see this kind of central line of which is actually a furniture that absorbs the sleeping, the kitchen, the toilet. So all these things in order to empty out the room. And you see it even more here in this kind of almost diagrammatic drawing in which we have the furniture that divides between a central empty space and an outside empty space, which then makes a differentiation which is merely from private to communal. No? So on the exterior, we have, as you see also in the section, the let's say private moments of existence and the private moment of business, if you want, of private business, which goes which looks towards outside, and inside the what then is the core of the communal villa. Yeah, and in between, precisely this absorption of these almost animal functions, so this kind of animal necessities. Another reference which I find interesting for discussing, the notion of typology today and this idea of typicality or atypicality is precisely the one that points to the atypical plan. So this is a very nice book by Jeanette Kuo. I invite you also to look at it if you're interested in the topic. And which tries to, let's say, go beyond the idea of the typical plan and come back to the atypical plan. So to reaffirm, if you want, this European gesture, and to say, okay, what are the atypical plans today, and can we investigate them? And it's interesting because I don't think what it makes is come back to typology, but rather in the listing of the listings and the differentiation of these atypical plans is rather a case study. So they cannot really be systematized in a typology, but it can only be, there can be a kind of declination or inflection of cases. No? So yeah, I think last time we were seeing with with Cornell, this idea of the inflection of the type. No, so this is, it kind of goes more into this idea of inflection, but without reducing it to a type. And so they cannot be ordered according to a logical structure, if you want, as Grassi would say, but they can only be enumerated, listed. But what I want to take from this book is actually just the opening pages. Just really, if you open the book, these are the two opening pages, which illustrate perhaps what could be an atypical plan. And on the one hand, we have the office. So these are the famous offices by Frank Lloyd Wright, the Johnson Wax administration offices on the right, I think. And on the left, we have the painting by Antonello da Messina, the Saint Jérôme in his study. And I find it interesting I find it interesting because it kind of lets us enter in this let's say three figures that I wanted to present you today. So the one of the study, the first one, which is one of the study, which is and it's interesting because it seems to make no difference between office and study. And it's today, yeah, perhaps we could say, yeah, why not? When I study, I kind of do some work, and when I'm in the office, I do some work. But it's not, let's say, an immediate thing, because office and study, actually, if you look into them, they almost spring from opposite. So the office business is precisely the idea of being busy. So this is where the word comes from. And study instead is something which precisely make a kind of void in this kind of daily activity, no? So we could have, so if you look at the words, for instance, business in Latin is negotium, which is precisely the negation of otium, so the negation of a time which is freed. Or again, in Greek we have scholia, from which school comes, and askolia. Askolia is precisely the absence of this free time, if you want, which is business. And if you want, again, there's this book by Hannah Arendt, The Human Condition, where these two things, the vita activa and the vita contemplativa, are put as almost opposite or to each other, or in a kind of polar relationship with each other. So one could study, if you want, because they are freed from business, from being busy. And study, it's interesting because even more than business, this is what I want to look at today, seems to have even more kinship to, or seems to give us an interesting way to look at what Colas describes the typical plan. And here I take a quote from, this is the PhD thesis from Emanuele Coccia, who is an Italian philosopher working in France, and is becoming more and more popular amongst architects with his most recent book. But actually his PhD thesis, I think, is his most interesting book, where he gives us this kind of provocation. He says, it is not reason, but study, the power distinguishing humans from all other beings capable of experience. So it's not this idea of the logos, of reason, but he says it is study. Study is what separates and detaches from, if you want, from those primitive aspects that we were seeing with the typical plan. So it is not reason or business, but study. But what is study? So he says, for something like study to be possible, knowledge must present itself as a potentiality and a possibility, unrelated and separated from the existence of the individual subject, and not as possession or belonging, nor as a knowledge already inherently owned. So study is not something, as we might be tempted to say, where I acquire knowledge, study is not the accumulation of knowledge, but it's precisely the opposite. So the kind of deprivation of any prior knowledge. So in study, I kind of release, so one kind of makes a void in order to potentially acquire knowledge. So it's a bit something which, if you want a similar movement to the one which we're seeing in the typical plan. So the subject, like the typical plan, has to be, so to say, poor or without qualities in order for study to happen. The possibility of study, he writes, is the gift that the condition of being an infant offers to humanity. Every time one studies, the condition of infancy is restored. Every student knows that infancy is not something past and distant, but a condition that must be constantly produced, sustained, and nurtured. In study, a person actively recreates their own infancy. So I put this quote because it's also an interesting provocation, because it shows us the study as something that enacts a kind of counter movement in time. No, it does not follows the progress of time, but it's as if it kind of counters. It brings us back to infancy, to this notion in which we are children, and therefore we have a kind of absolute potency in what we can acquire. So we are not already burdened with the knowledges we acquired. So if you want, if progress and evolution are movements in which things differentiate and branch in different species, this is also the other analogy. So different species as results, so in which they have determination. Study seems to be a kind of inverse movement to this. So it's a movement which goes again towards a de-differentiation instead of a differentiation, in a way which is not a regression, however. And here I borrow a quote from, actually not, I think it's another interesting way to frame this movement, which is from Michel Serres, the incandescent. So he calls it a bit more towards an incandescence, and relates precisely to evolution. He writes, as it advances, evolution differentiates. So this idea of the different species of evolution, if you want, no? Should it despecialize by erasing boundaries, it seems to go backwards. In progressing, it multiplies colors and shades. In regressing, it seems to turn pale and produce a candidate for incandescence. De-differentiated, forgetful, we became poor. So this idea that, yeah, we kind of reduce the differentiation of things. So we lose this kind of capitalization. But then he says, we discover that this incandescence mixes and potentially contains every color. By losing countless specificities, valencies of real powers, the zero-valent, nilpotent human, so this kind of zero degree again, became, without meaning, to no doubt, virtually omnivalent, totipotent, global, and infinite. So these two movements, so it's not a logical deduction or induction where by coming back, I just become more ignorant or more poor. Actually, this movement of de-differentiation is what opens up to an omnivalent and totipotent possibility. No? So it's a kind of infinite range of possibility. So there is a kind of connection between what would be a logical contradiction, so between this kind of zero degree and a kind of oneness of universality. No? So the more we de-differentiate, the more we study, if you want, the more we reach this totipotency. So a movement which is not just symmetrically countering evolution, but if you want, is making a pocket, a void in which, in this movement of evolution, in which this universality can be accommodated. And to symbolize, if you want this, I put a project of an architect that I know is very dear to Lorenzo, Hans Online. So the mobile office or mobile study, and actually it's interesting that bureau means desk, and desk is the lieu or the place of precisely of study of this totipotency, which creates a kind of pocket within these environments. No, the environment of evolution, where of differentiation, and this kind of project is interesting that it creates this kind of pocket in space, in the environment and in time, if you want, no. And I also put it because it allows me to connect this idea of study and this idea of typicality and all of this that we saw until now with the role of techniques. Huh? So this is clearly something that actually this is something that also Serres describes. So this incandescent study is something which attains through techniques. And here I quote Serres, he says, when we attain techniques, we invent an intention that replaces the absence of final causes. No, so if evolution, if this kind of natural, if you want, progress of things has no final causes, is just let's say what happens through this kind of mutation and selection. Technology, techniques is something that introduces final causes in an evolution that knew nothing of it. So techniques is a kind of detachment again from these primitive aspects and the constitution of a room of potency, of this kind of totipotency. So in this case, the pen, the paper, the desk, the air bubble, techniques, and architecture are here brought together. But what I'm interested in is also the question, if you want, of habits and of inhabitation. No? So how does this relate to habits? No? So our customs, our ritual, so the things we do in order to inhabit and dress up this space of abstraction from the world as it is. So if we live through techniques, through language, through study, through all these things, we live the world of things as they are, this kind of world of evolution, if you want. If we negate it to a certain extent, if we rise upon it, then the question is how to inhabit. No, so how to inhabit, if you want, this apeiron. No, again from the so this unbound, this pocket which is established through this separation. And I think it's there where architecture becomes key. No. Because architecture is also not just, if you want, it's not just a separation, like a bit like a techniques would allow for. So I need like a sharp separation, let's say, of the artificial from the natural. So it's not just this kind of separation, a sealing off, a bit like the project by online would say. So it's this kind of sealed environment. Architecture is also what constitutes a place of abstraction from the world of things, but does not refuse it. So it's established, if you want, a communication with it, a porosity, a percolation. Like this communication here is, if you want, just in the transparency, but then the air is sealed. So the question of inhabiting this new technical environment, this kind of no-stop city, as Archizum would have phrased it, is still posed in a way which creates a communication with the world of things. And here is where we pass to the second part of the lecture today, so to the temple. So we had, this relation between techniques, habits, human, and world of things. I think the temple is where they come together. So in which this world of things becomes, let's say, either divine or natural. And the temple, once again, is something which I understand as a boundary between the world of things and the human world. And if you want, gods are also what give finality, intention to a world that has none. So not just techniques, but also religion, gods, they domesticate it. And the temple is interesting because it's precisely a boundary between these two worlds, the world of things and the human world, which is not sealed, but is one which is percolating, is porous. So it has peristyles, it has columns, doors, windows, and in the case of the Pantheon, even oculi, no? So an architecture that articulates this border, and a border in which the parts, as we see with these two examples, are not fixed. So they are not constants in this sense. As these two examples show, no? So this also, I borrowed it from Lorenzo's lecture, no? So we have, on the one hand, we have the Parthenon, in which, if you want, the world of things is contained, is encrypted in this cell where the statue of the god is. So this world, which is the other than the human, so the divine, is hidden. And instead, the Pantheon is where the world of things, if you want, is pushed out. No, so we step in the center of the Pantheon. And here is even more striking, if you want, in the elevation. So this idea of, on the one hand, of this filter of the percolation of the columns that hide the gods from the human world and the polis, but still let us somehow see it in display of shadows. And the other one, the sphere, if you want, of the human universe that is contained in the Pantheon and looks outside to the world of things and even to the weather, no? Is even open to the weather through the oculus. So here outside is not the polis, and it was also interesting, but the urbs. So the city as a fact in itself, this kind of city which is in itself unbound, no, to a certain extent. So the polis, if you know, the city-state of the Greek is something which has a very precise limit, whereas Rome is actually not a city. So Rome is an urb, so it's an extension. Also, Rome yes, it is the city of Rome, but Rome, it's all until the Roman Empire can conquer. No, so there's a very different again relationship of these two, and I think these two examples are very interesting in the way they talk to each other. And also, if you want this articulation of a bond between the world of things and the human world is also shown in the way in which these two architecture neutralize gravity, no? So in which, in general, Greek architecture and Roman architecture neutralize gravity. On the one hand, we have the trilithic system, so the column and lintel system, which is deeply related to materials. So you cannot stretch the span of the columns as you like. So this is related to the resistancy of the stone itself. So the material properties of the stone itself, whereas the one of the arc is something that, to a certain extent, but to a large extent, is really able to, if you want, to transcend this kind of materiality. And also, it rather relates on the geometry itself. So, if you want, on the one hand, we have the natural properties of stone, and on the other, exploits the artificial wonders of geometry. So you see here, actually, in architecture, how techniques and habits in habitation, ornament, and natural artificial order come together. So how, if you want, cosmic and cosmetic come together, not just as a matter of etymology, but as a material fact, or also, if you want, cult and culture. So to the extension, if you want to resonate with the frame of the course, to the forms of living and figures of thought. And into this relationship, if you want, between the cosmos and the cosmetic, or between the idea of how classical ornament embody this connection, I think, and how it's not just, let's say, a matter of form or of logical construction. I pretty much like the proposition that George Hersey makes in this book, The Lost Meaning of Classical Architecture. And there, the temple is something as sacred, so nor public nor private. The temple is what hosts the gods, where the sacrifice to the gods are performed. So another form of exchange of bond between a world of things and world of human world. But Hersey's hypothesis goes a bit further. So the temple is not just the place of the sacrifice, it's not just a container of the sacrifice, but the temple itself and its orders, its ornaments, are the product of the sacrifice. So the temple is a sort of built memory or a sort of record of a mythical sacrifice. So the hypothesis of Hersey is one that is supported, if you want, by some evidence. So if you want, the connection between words and elements, so the fact that the capital of also the top part of the column is in fact oftentimes, so it also means head, so the capital is connected with caput, and in some instance we have figures such as the Caryatid, so the 6 daughters of the mythical king of Athens, Erechteus. And what Hersey says that these are not just ornaments, but these are actually what remains as a record of victims of a sacrifice, of a human sacrifice, which was really performed, and it's been transfigured and recorded into architects. So ornaments and classical orders are not just embellishments, but what he calls tropes. So, and here he writes, trope itself, the word and the thing, is linked to a type of sacrifice made in ancient warfare. So in Greek, tropos means style, turn, twist, hence the twisting of words. It is also connected with trophy, for trophies were originally erected at the point on the battlefield where the tide turned, etrepse, against the losers. Trophies, that is to say, mannequins form of the arms, weapons, and helmets of the slain enemy, were set up to appease the shades and to prevent the gods from punishing the victors who had killed them. Their deaths were thus turned or troped from murder into sacrifice. So you see the trope as a kind of figure of speech, not just a logical figure, but a figure of speech, as well as an architectural figure. So a figure of thought that has to do with forms of living, if you want, but it's something that creates what would be normally a logical contradiction. No? So these kind of victims that of the war are dismembered and remembered in a way in which then turns them from enemies to protectors of the city or of the troops. yeah, here you have an example of what he was saying. So this idea of trophy, so this dismemberment and rememberment of the thing. And this is, let's say, something that has to do with the classical orders. And it is interesting because it's also a notion of memory, not just as a record of facts as they are, but as something which is constituted rather than simply recording or found. So an active relationship with memory. He says Greek sacrifice involved the deconstruction and reconstruction of the victims' bodies. When the fire finishes its meals, the bone and ashes are reunited in an urn. This act is at once a joining together and a foundation, as in the Latin word condere. Thus, an urn with its content, it is a concretion or reconstruction of the dead person within it. It is one more form of preserved and recorded sacrifice. So you see what I was saying before with the idea of memory or an active memory. And an active memory, which has to do, by the way, with sacrifice, which I forgot to say, but it's precisely, if you want, a reduction to nothing. So it's this kind of reduction to 0 degree of something. No? And this is something which is not there in Hersey, which is interesting, but it's also, it's another thing which he forgets to say is that this condere, this kind of idea of founding and of joining together, so it's almost an architectural joining of things, has also another meaning. Condere also means to hide in Latin. And so it's not just a matter of, if you want, the construction and reconstruction, also of encryption. So there is also a hiding and revealing movement, which is embodied by this idea of the troping ornament. And this is also, if you want, what you can understand in the connection between the temples of the classical architecture with another kind of temple, with a very different kind of temple. This is the plan of Solomon's temple as described in the scripture and reconstructed or deciphered, if you want, by Isaac Newton. This is interesting because, so this example is interesting because now I just present you the reconstruction by Newton, but there are many reconstruction or decryptions of this temple. And this is because this temple is not something which we have a memory, like a trace, an archaeological trace of existence, but it's a temple which is reconstructed actually after the way in which it is inscripted in the scripture. So this temple is reconstructed actually after text. So the scripture describe the way in which the temple of Solomon was built, and this kind of translation from words into drawing is not something transparent. It's something which leaves a certain room of uncertainty, if you want. And this is why we have different versions of different editions, in which are different renderings, if you want, in which this temple can be imagined. So there is, again, in this idea, again, if you want, of encryption or decryption, there is again this opacity, this hiding of things, which is there. And this is also an interesting temple because it differently, for instance, from the Greek and the Roman temple, this is the one temple. So it's a temple which cannot, so the God there is the one God, and the temple is one. So once this temple is destroyed, so this kind of second destruction of the temple, it cannot be simply rebuilt elsewhere. So it can all, it's lost forever, if you want, no? So in this case, it's almost as if the temple itself is destroyed and sacrificed in order to be engraved in the scripture. So architecture itself, if you want, becomes the victim, the scapegoat, this mythical figure. And here I think there's an interesting relation that weighs back architecture to the figure of study. And here I'm quoting a book by Roberto Calasso, the book on all books, which is about the Old Testament, which talks about the passage, if you want, from the performance of sacrifice to their recitation. He says, this was the main difference for Israel after the destruction of the temple, that the sacrifice could just as well be recited. Once that the temple was lost, everything must become pure mental gesture. So again, we have from the word of things to the human word, a kind of contract between the word of things to the human word, from the abstract one of the mind. So again, a bond between the two, which is here brought from architecture back to actually recitation, to language, or to the activity of the mind. But he writes, but the need for the sacrifice and its corrected remained as before. Even without the temple, the sacrifice would still be there, because someone has to intercede, the priest. It is not just the Torah that is needed, but also the request for forgiveness. It is important that man has a feeling of unworthiness with regard to the word. And here I place this passage because it highlights, again, a depth towards the word, an exchange between man and the word, so between the human word and the word of things, which is something based here in religion, specifically on what could be understood as an original debit, which has to do with precisely this kind of detachment that we had with techniques from the word. No? So we kind of refuse the word of things through techniques, through this kind of bubble of online, and therefore it's as if we need to give something back to the word. Another thing which is interesting, and here I'm going quite fast, but which is interesting of this translation from architecture back to scripture, so or back to study, is that the church is not the temple, no? So to say it's simple temple. So the temple is a unique place. So it's a place that can be only in that place, especially Solomon one was the one temple. It has a kind of a very important location. But the church, if you want, is a kind of typical abstraction of the temple. So the church is not really defined really by its architecture, like its temple, as much as from its furniture. So the altar, the pulpit, the benches. So the architecture of the temple becomes, if you want, emancipated from it. So once the ritual is engraved and is encrypted in the scripture, the architecture of the temple is something which becomes, to a certain extent, if you want, more typical, more generic. And here you see, now I just put one example, but if you think of the history of the typologies, if you want, of the church, we start from the basilica, which is the most generic of Roman architecture, then we move to the cathedral, and here we come, let's say, to one of the most, let's say, extreme manifestation, this kind of industrial box by Morasuti and Mangiarotti in Milan, this church, which is basically just a box, no? So it's a box, and it contains what matters there is that there is an altar, that there is a book, and then there is a kind of furniture that allows for this ritual to take place. So whereas in the temple has its own very consolidated typology, if you want. And here, again, in the connection between the written temple, if you want, the scriptural one with the study, it's also something which is there. I quote again from Calasso. He says, in the Talmudic vision, the main thing is the study, if possible, an interrupted study. So it's not that there is life and that there is study as well. There is study, and life has become an emanation of study. To substitute sacrifice with study, a bold enterprise that began after the second destruction of the temple with rabbinic Judaism and developed over a century. So study as a replacement of sacrifice, and again, as something which repays a debt towards the word of things. So that enacts an exchange between the human word and the word of things. And scripture, so what is the place of study as establishes this boundary of this exchange. So scripture has taken this architectural or architectonic task. What then of architecture? Calasso writes, the hair of the temple was not the synagogue, but the yeshiva, the house of study. The yeshiva was an empty room where nothing was like, again, an empty room, again, we have it again, where nothing was lacking so long as there was a scroll to read. So yeshiva, church, study, typical plan, something that always accommodates, if you want, a program, a function, a destination, without establish a direct signification with them. Perhaps the break of the calligram with the apple that we were seeing before. So there is a relation which is not of direct signification of representation, but it's more articulated in all these places. No? There's a kind of container and contained are not directly determined. And okay, I'm going quite fast, but yeah, maybe we have time for questions later, because here we come to the last part of the presentation. So until now, we have this kind of different contracts, exchange pacts. So one with time and with speciation, with the idea of evolution, with the divine. And in general, a contract between what I was saying, the human world and the world of things. And the last architectural, it's not nor a type, perhaps it's a figure, but what I would perhaps call these three architectural figures are templates, perhaps, I don't know, is the one that perhaps best embodies this contract between the human world and world of things, or with nature. And it's the one of the garden. And I always like this example. This is a project by Office Kerstengers, David van Severen with Wohnens called Border Crossing, because it kind of articulates this question that underlies the statement by Kachai, you know, that one does not inhabit a peron, one does not inhabit the unbounded. So in a word, if you want, of bounds and of boundaries, of social contracts, the word of different nations, the question here is, how do we establish an exchange and a communication with what exceeds them? So in this case, nature, the divine, the world of things. And this garden is a garden which is placed precisely directly on the border, and not just on the border, but as a border between states. No, so between these are the two. This is Mexico and USA, and this garden is placed upon them. No, and as a border. So the idea is that someone crossing the border has to cross this garden. This is an excerpt from the description of the project. It says, they say this neutral territory, again, neutral idea of this zeroness, interrupts the endless fence of the demarcated boundary, serving as a bureaucratic waiting gap between the exit from one country and the entrance to the other. Within its walls, a dense, regular grid of palm trees, fed by a system of irrigation channels, creates an oasis-like garden, a contained and precise cultivated space, opposed to its sprawling surroundings. Like a model of an earthly paradise, this interior garden provides a certain comfort on the way to the promised land, or a reflection on the desire for it. So it's, again, a place of contemplation or reflection. So it provides this boundary, if you want, which is just a line with a depth. So it's a kind of, again, this idea of a depth, if you want, can make it analogous to the typical plan. And it's not just not just depth like a thickness, not just a matter of size, but of scale as something which is its own autonomy. So a void in the world of nations, in the fullness of nation. And in this void, things mix. So Mexico with the US, nature with culture, heavens and earth in the idea of the earthly paradise. And it's not just a mixture, so it's not just a blending of things, not as a homogeneous melange, but a mixture with a certain order. So it is a cultivated space. This, of course, resonates, if you want to come back to Colas with another project of Colas, which is actually his master thesis done with Elias Zengelis and Madeleine Vriesendorp, Exodus of the Voluntary Prisoner of Architecture in 73. And this is a project that, if you want, takes the idea of the Berlin Wall and the idea that the Berlin Wall as a kind of functional thickness and turns it around, this thickness into a model for a possibility for an architectural and, if you want, political autonomy from the space and the urbanism of the city. But it's a project that, if you want, especially in contrast with the one of Office, is a project that, to my understanding, refuses any otherness or thinks of otherness still within the social. So there is architecture here, a bit like the one of the rationalists, is a kind of self-referential practice. No, so it's something in which the otherness is only evoked via negativa, as a negative, but it doesn't really address something which is else than the human, or perhaps something, as if it does so, is actually the psyche of the human itself. So it's something that, if you want, we could see it almost as a post-structuralist project, in the sense that it kind of tries to go over structuralism by actually still using it as a word, no, a bit like the word post-structuralist does. And what I like about the garden is that it can get that too. So create a space, another space of the social within the social, but also go beyond the social. And here is also another reference that I like to quote about gardens. So this is an article by Pier Vittorio Aureli and Maria Sherazad Giudici, Gardens, a Concise History, that looks at the garden precisely as a way to rethink the social and the contracts that are implicitly at work with it in. So for instance, in their case, what is interesting is this kind of capitalistic contract, let's say, which is at work within the social. What they say is that the garden blurs the traditional distinction between the public and the private. So here, these are the two sides that the garden contract. And what they're interested in is that the garden is the first act of marking land property, but at the same time, once again, it's not a property in itself. No, so the garden is this kind of mixed space. So if you think about the house and the garden in front, yes, it's a private space, but it's also a place in which is not as private as the one of the house. No. And what they write is that the garden could be a way to profane the idea of the private property. So to kind of liberate it. And it's interesting that they use the term profane, which has to do with the sacred once again. And another thing which is interesting of the garden in their words is that it's not a generic space. So like, for instance, a shopping mall. So in this kind of movement of de-differentiation does not just fall in genericity. They say gardens can cater to a larger number of people and be very inclusive, generous. They are open places, but not generic spaces that should fit anyone. So they still have a potential for specificity without being specific or typological space, if you want. And in this sense, not only people, but also animal, vegetal species too. Even the weather is open to the garden. So everything, so the garden opens itself to these different entities, if you want, or to different agencies, or the different pronouns, but it does so not just as a mess, but as a place with an architectural order. And we can also see this relationship, if you want, between garden and house, which I was pointing before, can also see once again in the Roman inversion. Now we've seen before the Roman inversion of the Pantheon, and in the Roman house, the garden is not in front, but is what inside. And this idea of the peristylium and the Roman garden is actually it's interesting because it's at the core of the house, and yet is the most public space of the house. Is where guests are invited, and also where the weather actually is invited. So it often hosts this impluvium, no, that collects the rainwater. So a bit analogous to the Pantheon. It welcomes the weather, and is a place where this kind of boundary between inside and outside, public and private, human word and word of things, so not just divine, but even the weather one, are coming together. So they're made as a contract. And again, as I was saying, not just the human is inhabiting the garden, but also the word of things is invited to become familiar, to get a familiar face, to become a persona and become less strange, if you want, less foreign to each other. And in this sense, the garden is perhaps the best architectural embodiment of what, in my understanding of what Michel Serres calls the natural contract. So a contract that on one hand rethinks the idea of contract beyond the social contract, so beyond this idea of Rousseau, of a contract between people, or if you want the contract of, so what Hobbes called the Leviathan, also this mass of people that come together and establish society. So an idea that goes beyond this idea of social, but at the same time also rethinks the nature beyond a kind of vegetal fetishization. So it rethinks nature, as I was saying. So this idea of word of things is what I borrow from Serres. No? So as a word of things, which is opposed or has to come into contact with the human word. And there are many editions of the book. I chose this one because I think it's interesting. I think it's one of the first, and it comes, or the second, and it comes. So in the cover, there's not. So in the first cover, there's the picture of the earth, and in the last one, there's a tree. But in this one, there are two people fighting, which is apparently contradicting. But it's actually, this is the opening pages of the book. They're called the opening. The the opening chapter is called War and Peace, and it describes a conflict. So it describes a scene in which two individuals are fighting. They're each having an argument. They are, let's say, at war with each other. And what Serre writes, he says, suppose two speakers determined to contradict each other, as violent as their confrontation might be, as long as they are willing to continue the discussion, they must speak a common language in order for the dialogue to take place. There can't be an argument between two people if one speaks a language the other cannot understand. So there is already a proposition of language, not just if you want, as a procedure or a logical order of things, but as something else, so a kind of common code in this fight, a kind of tacit contract to which both of the speakers, both of the rivals have to commit. This is a contract that they both have to implicitly sign in order to keep on discussing. And in the same pages, Serre highlights how even war is a state of law. Even war is a contract. So war is not just undifferentiated violence, but especially now it's a bit a different status, but especially in the already 100 years ago, war was a state of law. So one had to declare war to the other. So it's a kind of contract. And the main difference, if you want, is between war and violence. So war is something that gives order to violence. But there are many, if you want, scales of these things, and or maybe techniques actually of conflicts. One is war, and the other one is an argument in language. No? So, and these are the different techniques that abstract precisely from violence as the word of things. And what he says is, so there is something at work between these two rivals, so between these two subjects, between these two social subjects, something of a mechanics which is similar to the one seen, for instance, with the classical orders. He says that the two parties to the disputes exchange fair arguments on low-down insults along one diagonal, while on the second, sideways or across, more often without the speaker's knowledge, their contractual language fights inch by inch against the ambient noise to preserve its purity. So this diagonal, if you want, is crossed by another one. A second invisible battle takes place, the one between language and noise. So we could say that this tacit contract of language established something like a pocket upon noise, no? Like a contract of war establishes a pocket of legality upon violence. So we have this idea of inhabiting, making a void, making a pocket within this unboundedness. And war and peace, disagreement and agreement, are not logical opposite, but two sides of the spectrum engendered by this contract. These two crossing lines, so this one between the social one, let's say, and the natural or the factual one that we see here, are of a different nature. He writes that in the first case, it's a subjective battle, that is, one between subject, the adversaries. But in the second case, it's an objective battle between two nameless agencies that has yet no legal status. So you start to see what this idea of nature, of objectivity, and of natural contract might into. So it's not just a kind of naive or banal idea of, yeah, let's be friends with nature, let's be nice to nature. No, it's something that has to do with also uncomfortable concepts like the one that is objective violence, and of something which is a bit more abstract than that. Yeah, I was mentioning, so there is on one hand, there is this subjective violence, the one between contracts, between the subject, between the rivals. And he says what this kind of other line outlines reveal is one of the objective violence, the one of the word of things. And he says today we are it's an interesting period because objective violence is something, so this natural word, this word of things, this one of objective violence is one that used to always outpower man, if you want. It used to be on the background because man was never able to, the human world was never able to be on the same level with it. No? So it was a kind of, if you look also, this is interesting in the landscape. So in the landscape, in the painting used to be always on the back. No? So it's always been on the background because it's paradoxically is always something which is much more, if you want, powerful than the human world. But today, there is, let's say, one of the critical point is precisely the invention of the atomic bomb. This notion is not the same. So the word is actually, we consider the word as something not which we have to be afraid of, because it's threatening us. It's not these gods, these gods that can be angry at us, but actually something that's fragile, that we have to protect from the social, actually, from this leviathan that has grown out of measure, so that has acquired, if you want, a bigness. He says it's at stake not this or that person, these or that people. He says what is at stake is Earth in its totality and humanity collectively. So there is a kind of totalization of violence which is there, a shift of scale, again, a bigness. It is not just a matter of, again, of dimension, it's qualitative. So the human world, he says, so what he says is the human world has grown beyond a kind of critical mass and falls by doing so from the living to the inanimate. A phrase that also actually I'm quoting from him and regards precisely city. He says megaloposes are becoming physical variables. They neither think nor gaze, they weigh. So there is a heaviness, there is a kind of a critical scale that has been reached, if you want, in which the world of things, so the human world is entering the world of things. And this was written in 1993. In 2000, we have this concept, the one of Anthropocene. Many of you might know it. So, which is precisely, if you want, gives us a definition of it. No, so the effect of man is something which has an effect on a geological scale. So on the world of things par excellence, the one of stones. No. So it's a shift of scale that corresponds to a qualitative shift from living to inanimate. So from thinking to weighing. And he writes a phrase which is, yeah, I think very, 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 that really captures the idea of Anthropocene, to which he doesn't refer because the book is prior to it. He says, global history enters nature, global nature enters history. And this is something utterly new in philosophy. So history and nature, the world and world of things are not unbound for each other. They enter one another. They kind of invade the territory. There is a kind of war that is in effect there. So there is and therefore there is a new bond, a new threshold that can be crossed, and has to be established. No, so this is the necessity, if you want. Now we have a necessity for a natural contract in this kind of invasion of fields, invasion of global history into nature and of global nature into history. What we have to think is a contractuality, a state of law for this to be, let's say, for there to be a possibility of not just of war as a legal status, but then hopefully of peace, no, of reaching a peace between the two. And the contract is precisely what at the same time establishes the boundary and what makes this boundary visible to us. In the book, he says that the only agency that so far that is able to deal with such a thing has been scientific knowledge. And scientific knowledge also here, I think, is interesting in this book, is not precisely not as a logical construction or as this discovery of truth. So it's not this kind of anxiety of certainty, but rather, he says, scientific knowledge is what converts laws into facts and vice versa. So scientific knowledge has to do with law again and with the world of things, and it's a kind of contracting, it's a kind of transformation, it's a kind of exchange between things and human facts through law. He says scientific knowledge results from the passage that changes a cause into a thing and a thing into a cause. That makes a fact become a law, de facto become a jure, and vice versa. So it is a kind of science, again, that does not think, if you want, that the real is the rational, as the logic of science in Hegel would say, no? So that all the word, as long as we find it's the language of the word, we can kind of find its rationality. But in which real and rational are in a relationship with each other, which is of equipolence, which means of equal, if you want, potentiality, no? So, and I think the way I want to think, so this is not what Sarah says, but I think it's where he points us, is that we could think that the real and the rational are in a position in which the real, if you want, can be contained in the rational, as much as the rational can be contained in the real. So in that kind of architectonic relationship between container and contained. So there is a kind of, if you want, breadth between them. Also the breadth, this is in one of the Kocha's book on plants, he says breadth is where this relationship between container and contained is inverted. No? So when we breathe, what contains us becomes what we contain, so the air, and vice versa. No? So, and this, I think real and rational in this light of the contract must be think in this their equivalence, perhaps in this way, in this articulation between container and contained. And the garden, once again, is perhaps can be seen as the place, the lieu of this breadth, of this contracting, and also a miniature it, or reduction of it, in which, we can, we can have this kind of articulation. And perhaps to come back to the beginning, also we have this idea of a logical construction. What I think, and of types, I think the garden can perhaps, if you want, save the notion of type from an analytical perspective, because in the garden, this kind of breadth can be articulated in many ways. So not just a logical one, also a logical one, but in many other ways. So if you want, in different, not in one logos, but in different logoi. And we think, for instance, there could be botanical gardens that are much more towards, let's say, this notion of type and of analysis. No, we kind of sample the plants and we try to describe the different type of plants and the breedings between the different species. So they go more in this kind of a notion of types and evolution. But also, we can also think of other kind of gardens or other actually ways of gardenings. So, for instance, the art of topiary, the one that cuts the plants in order to give them a certain form. So this is, for instance, what is there in the Palatine garden, also in which we give shape to certain plants. Or once again, we can think of the Zen garden, no, in which there is a kind of dialogue between the human trace and the trace of the time, no, that disperses, that so as a kind of entropy makes the space makes this trace go away. And all of these, if you want, are different ways precisely to articulate, if you want, this passage from fact into law and vice versa. So these kind of these things that Sarah was ascribing to the scientific knowledge is somewhere there in an architectural way in the garden. Also, this idea that we pass from fact into law, or from the word of things, or there's a communication between the word of things and the human word. And what is interesting is that, perhaps differently from the temple, and that this contract is not in the hands of a human agency only, or there is not just an opposition between, let's say, human and natural, or human and divine, but the word of things itself can become a persona. It needs to enter and collaborate, step in and sign the contract as well. No, so the garden, what is interesting of the garden is that, as differently from other architecture in which there is design and then the execution, is that the execution of the garden does not rely only on the workers, but it also relies on water coming down from the sky, the nature to do its work. No, so nature and the word of things have an agency, and also chance, if you want, to have an agency in the garden. They kind of appear. They can appear as almost legal entities. No, they have to sign the contract of construction of the garden. So it not only abstracts from anthropocentries, but it makes rooms, it casts a void for an impersonal agency to step in. So a kind of, not an I, a you or a we, but a kind of one, or an it, an impersonal it, we don't know how to call it. So it does so not through one logical construction, but by opening up possibility for, again, from different logoi, so the idea of species, of botanics, of topiary, of Zen gardens, so different contracts or mode of communication that can be nevertheless cultivated. So it's not just a mess or a blending, but it is a way in which things can be cultivated according to an order, which is, again, not necessarily human or divine, but it can be impersonal. And yeah, perhaps this is to connect to this idea that I have of this title. At least I don't have. It's more of a question that the definition, but perhaps we should not speak of different types as a kind of classification, so going towards the typology, but of different typings. So of these almost tactile ways to shape and communicate with the garden and with space, if you want, as a screen. So as a space that can accommodate endless form, that is indifferentiated, and therefore can has this kind of totem potency, and therefore can transcend the idea of type. So this was a bit the idea, and then perhaps this can also help us give us a key of looking at what is happening today with the digital, but also use the digital to look at architecture. And yeah, here I put this kind of provocation on who is typing. No? So it's not anymore the human, but it's something else who is typing. No? And it's like, hi, it's ChatGPT. No? So this could be, yeah, I leave it open as a kind of provocation. But that's it. Thank you.
The end is the digital garden.
Yeah, perhaps the end is the digital. I mean, then one can think of digital environments, no, and how do we step in this environment by typing, and by, let's say, typing is a way to ascribing to the contract. So, and then typing to type. But this is, let's say, something which is yet to be formulated. And I thought it was more interesting to look at architectures rather than yeah, than indulge too much in digital technology.
The discussion, I think we can take 15 minutes or 20 minutes to ask a couple of questions. It's open to everyone, of course, so you are really welcome to questions. I will just start for a matter of on one side education, for I guess on the other side because it's probably faster. First of all, thanks, because it's the second lecture that you give in this, or you gave it already once last year, and it was really different, which is something that is really rare, because when you invite somebody twice for the same purpose, it's really likely that you get more or less the same lecture. This was not the case, and I found it really generous suggestion. Second, it was really rich of many things. Yeah, it was really dense. I think also maybe on certain parts complex to come with you in this garden. I mean, this journey from the studios or the study place to the office building and the temple and the garden. Maybe one thing that I would like, because it's something I've always been extremely fascinated by the 0 degree, and I never actually really understood it. So, but the interesting thing that you were referring to the 0 degree, or actually the question would be not so much what is it, because I think it's not the place maybe to discuss it, but it's more like you said typical plan, or actually Formen writing typical plan is the end of architectural history, the 0 degree of architecture. And then there is Barth coming with the idea of the 0 degree. I know that Shinohara was really interested in the notion of the 0 degree, and I think also in kind of bringing together machine and 0 degree. He refers to Tokyo in some of his writings as the is a city as the 0 degree machine. So in a certain sense, I think not far from what you were proposing. So in a certain way, a physicality that is capable to accommodate basically everything and everyone. My question would be, in a certain sense, let's say one of the possible questions would be, how do you differentiate this typicality that you were talking about in a certain sense, or how do you see it differently, or what is the line, let's say, of separation between typicality and genericity, between genericity and generality, between generality and universality, in a certain sense, or how do you kind of bring them together, you know, or in a way, for you, for Thomas through your eyes, or for Barth through your eyes, or for Newton's through your reading of the plan. The the question would be, how can we talk about a typicality in a categorical way, the way you're proposing, that becomes in itself universal, no?
Mhm.
So, and therefore that does not propose a differentiation in a certain sense or a classification. So it does not go with the notion of classical notion of the types. I mean, even if Mattia's book is really beautiful, it's, as you said, it stays in a classical notion of types, and I would say even more in typology. You know, so this really this horizontal gesture of trading hands, let's say. But how actually it becomes on one side a typicality that is universal. So in a way that by accommodating it also mirrors something that is in a certain sense transcendent to a building itself, and how also this you think can become a way of design. No? So how do you see this typicality, or which kind of architects maybe you think, apart from Colas, or also with Colas, were able in a way to embody this typicality and this typing in a certain sense through architecture or within architecture, and also installing or establishing this relationship between a figure and I think in my understanding your idea of typicality and a domain of what you call the world of things, so something that is by definition beyond around a project itself.
Yeah, so these questions of actually it's true. It's I actually never like to repeat lectures, so it's like it's very, I have quite almost a scatological relationship with my work, but once I've done it, it's gone. I don't want to redo it. So, and actually I use this opportunity to go in a territory where, so I have some things some instruments and some things that I worked on that helped me navigate, but it's mostly unexplored territory for me here. And I am actually glad that you gave me this opportunity to do it, to create this pocket of time to study this thing. And this also to say that I don't really know, I don't have really a formula to distinguish, for instance, this idea of typicality, universal, genericity. So these are things that are starting to get into constellation for me. One way that I think could be useful to in a way in which we could perhaps phrase it is, I think, generation. So the notion of the general and of genericity have something to do with the moment in which perhaps we try to positivize or to represent, but perhaps to positivize universality. And so in that sense, I'm not sure we can make a space of universality. So that's why I like the way in which, for instance, Serre phrased it in Incandescence. He says, it doesn't say the universal, but it says access to the universal. So this is also why I had the intuition not to say typing the universal, but typing to the universal. So the universal is this kind of finality, of which he calls, this kind of finality which is introduced, but it's also not just, it's a finality not just as a line, but it's also something that opens a domain, a pocket. So it's a space, it's hard, it's not sure if to call it a space, a room. So it's this kind of void, which has to do with the zero-ness. And it's a void in which then specificity and generality, if you want, are two movements. So it works with these two as movement, not as logical contradictions. No? And the zero-ness has to do with a kind of exchange between them, which is balanced, but not as an overall balance, but precisely as this kind of double keeping of things. And it's something very hard to grasp, but I think in physics, the best way is these two concepts of entropy and negative entropy, so of differentiation and de-differentiation, which are not absolute, but they are related to communication. And this is where then the idea of noise, of language, of the objective noise or objective violence come into play. So the kind of giving order to these things, which is actually giving it order by placing scales or scalarities. I still don't know, but by creating scales in which or ladders that we can go up and down with. But I'm realizing I'm getting a bit even more abstract. But and yeah, perhaps so. The idea of in the work of the architects, I don't think we can look at the plan and say, this is where it happens. So I wouldn't say like, I don't know, then Baroque makes the void, and then it's Baroque and rather than, or the Pantheon rather than. So I think what I like of your example is that both the Pantheon and the Parthenon do the same in completely different ways. So there are two different logoi in my understanding, and in that sense, radically mirrored or inverse to each other. But then what I try to say is that also the scriptures, the temple, and then the church, so they all kind of enact this kind of movements, this kind of double movement in their own way. What perhaps I mean, what is to a certain extent very banal as a reply, but I think architects that always go beyond the mere domain of architecture, and this I say also. So I was saying before, not what Widler was saying about the rationalists, is that they enact type within architecture. Yes, they do, but Rossi, Grassi, and all of these, they write a lot, so they are philosophers. No, for Rossi, the type is almost like the embodiment of a kind of Platonic. I mean, this is not exactly the right term, but so they always they create this. They work analogically in that sense, not analogically in the sense not digitally, but in the sense that they do not work analytically. So they or not just analytically. So they create these bridges between domains that are completely alien to each other, precisely like the human world and the world of things, or So, and this is what was interesting mostly in my thesis. This kind of the idea of an image or an architectonic image as something that does not positivizes something, does not represent a reality, but that casts a bridge between domains which are completely alien to each other. And I think the architects that try to do it, so it's not a case that the architect that we recognize as masters are basically all the ones that do this. No, so and most of the time is interestingly between let's say writing and drawing, but it must not be just that. And so it can be also something else.
Maybe another point that is interesting, starting again from Colas. I mean, starting again from Colas and connecting it to the zero degree. So, in a certain sense, advanced chemistry architecture is in the zero degree of architecture. And if I understood correctly, you read, I mean, Colas is somebody that is an architect who's also extremely interested in thought, even though he never kind of name it in a certain sense, but most of his, or some of his most interesting projects, like the never built bibliothèque in Paris, or even the Seattle Library was built, interestingly, it was always to do void and library, so void and study in a certain sense. Comes from probably, I would say, or maybe it's a bit of an interpretation that I'm doing now, of sketchy, but comes from the idea of the zero degree. So if we have to think about void as that which is capable to do precisely, I think architectonically what you were referring now, also this for me, void is and the faith that we as architects have to have in void, knowing that is of course something that it's not in our hands. Even a magician can, in a certain sense, deal with void. But still, void is what we are mostly worried about. Every time we do a project, void becomes, in a certain sense, the hidden ingredient, I could say, or the ingredient that we cannot really use, and yet is what we want to do. And therefore, any architectonic gesture, it's being it walls, columns, ceilings, floors, roofs, whatever, they are an articulation of void, in my perception. And interestingly, with Colas and the parallel notion, the kind of parallel trace that we can have between the typicality and the void becomes, I think, or at least for me, a way of really, I mean, a method actually, in architecture, no? Or a method even for design in a certain sense. So on one side, what you were referring to is a typical plan as something that is so much disembodied from any cultural construction, one could say, which is, I think, why I mean, it's interesting to start saying, well, of course, the Pantheon and the Parthenon, they both are temples, and it's so stupid. I mean, nobody is so stupid to ask which is better, which is the one that contains the god better, or we can talk about the Taj Mahal or Solomon's or the Pyramid of Giza. I mean, they are all, in a certain sense, cases for this complex thing that architecture tries to do, which is bringing the main that's really far away into communication. No? In the temple, of course, it's, I mean, I agree with you, it becomes one figure that's specifically addressing it. I think also the house can do, especially the monofamiliar house, because it becomes, in a certain sense, a temple that is, I don't want to say private, because it's not so much about the privacy, but it's more about the fact that it's a miniature of the world, the house, in that sense. You know? So everyone that inhabits, and the great houses are inhabited by many different people. That's the cool thing also. You know? Family changes, people change, but the house basically stays the same. So the question would be, can we think about the void that Thomas is referring to, and within the notion of the typicalism is really doing, a bit as one could call the neutral element. Right? So really the void of the architect, so the void, the architectonic void, maybe that's the good way to put it, because otherwise it gets really fuzzy also as a way of thinking. Can we think it as the neutral element? So can we really think it as something that, without touching it, yet being extremely attentive to it, is what negative, or in a mirroring way, or in a counter reaction way, it's what actually really gives the means to the architect to draw it, no? By drawing it borders or boundaries, as you would say.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Yeah, and I think, yeah, I'm not sure, but I think then this is always this kind of oscillation or breath between void and fullness. No, that I think it's interesting to look at. No, this kind of idea of this neutralization that gives access to universality. So universality being one. No, so this idea of everything turning around one. This is the etymology of the word. Yeah, then I think, yeah, so the neutral element embodies this in mathematical terms. Yeah, and
also architectural, because in a way, to me,
yeah, no, to think of the void in these terms. Yeah. So then it abstracts it. I think it's also helpful because it abstracts it only from a notion of drawing lines, drawing around the void as a to paraphrase Adolf Loos. So, which is also interesting. How he writes words around the void. But it's yeah. Then you could actually abstract the void from a mere idea of surface or of space, which is 3D space. No? So then you could bring it to other dimensions. And I think this is what all the great architects do to that. So.
All right, then I do myself. I think it was really beautiful when you write, or when you said, Collas affirms universality is something that cannot be conquered, therefore not a place but a condition.
Yeah.
And in this, I think it's, in my understanding, it's really a bit what I think we are trying to do in this course, let's say, to really bring architecture to the notion of, I mean, the forming of the void, even though it's a stupid way of saying it, I think, forming the void, it's, I don't want to accept the fact that it's stupid and still uses it. or I'm not happy with the idea of forming body because it's not really about forming. It's more about bounding it.
Yeah.
And I think the boundary, and of course, the boundary in a certain sense kind of gives a form, but it's not the form of the body itself that becomes prior, but it's the kind of affirmation of itself. But anyway, I think it was really beautiful the fact that you say it's not a place. So, in a certain sense, universality is not something that actually is real. Also, coming to the last part of the lecture is let's say the relationship between real and rational. In a certain sense, this notion of universality, when it's not a place, but it's a condition, it's a place, or it's something that is not real in physical terms, and therefore cannot be affirmed in physical terms. So maybe my question would be, how do you think that architecture can take on this this notion of universality, not through embodying it, but in which terms? So you presented some figures that are capable to do it. And maybe the question that I would have now is how to bring together these figures to find a certain general attitude of the figures. So you presented three, I presented also others, but I think that the figures becomes for us simply a way of thinking figuratively, but not figurative in terms of forms. And this is also interesting. But so what is the relationship between, let's say, the translation the figure is capable to do from a building to this non-real universality or not concretizing universality?
Yeah, I think the figure can what the figure can do, or what the image can do, is embody this, is articulate and embody this contract between, for instance, between the real and the rational. And this contract, we can think of it, it's hard to think of it in geometrical terms, but has to do with something. So if the universal is something that is a matter of access, as Serre says, it's a bit like a wall and a door. So this is also the void. How can you think of it? No. So this this contract casts a wall and at the same time opens a door. So this is how it's how to think the relationship to it. But it's and then we can think of what is beyond the door. But I think this is how I would say to think of it in abstract and architectonic terms. But
interestingly, is also if you remember, there is this book that we discussed more than one time. It is the idea of universal architecture from Scamozzi, but actually by Scamozzi, which is basically the treatise that is let's say, the founding gesture of this course. And the cover or the frontispiece, better, it is a door. And it's so in a certain sense, maybe there is also this notion of accessing. I think it's also interesting that universal contains both the access, but also a certain kind of tension. It's a direction towards. It's a towards one. It's
this kind of finality. It's what I find interesting in there is that it's both this kind of finality of incandescence, so this finality which is introduced with techniques, but also a way to give this finality an habit, so an inhabitation. So it's also, it appears also in elevation, so to say. And it's not necessarily a door that has to be crossed, but it's a door there. So precisely like the frontispiece of Scamozzi, so it's a door that marks something, so that points to something. So it's indexical, is not so it's I would say it's also representative, but not in a sense of so it's a bit more like a mask. So it
you find them afterwards, no?
Sorry?
Like types, do you find them afterwards? but sometimes like looking back, I think,
Mm-hmm.
like example like Christian churches that were sometimes the example of like this very beautiful genealogy here, and they were like a very long time.
Yeah.
And my question was, so at the moment when they were building the business plan, how were we building and like, so what is like, what makes a strong case for like this typical buildings not being like some years?
Yeah, I mean, so do you mean? I mean, I think so. That yeah, you're right. I don't think they were. I mean, I don't know. To a certain extent, I think they were aware of building types, and actually, types. This is also their function, no? So to give a kind of model to be repeated. So this is also in actually when the notion of type is proposed in its first instance by Quatremer de Cancy in the encyclopedia. It's crossed precisely with the model. So for him, the model is what is repeated in the same way, and the type is what can gather these different forms to a oneness to a certain extent. But then it's a oneness that becomes a way to discretize things in different classes. And there you see also the resonance with the encyclopedia, and also this idea almost of a dictionary, of different words that then you learn and you classify. I think what is interesting with the proposition of Colas of the typical plan is a bit. So he says that it's in relation to history is what puts an end to architectural history, in the sense that it opens up this kind of room for indeterminacy. So it's not one type or another, but it's precisely just its function, just because it has this core of services, this kind of square facade, and then this floor. So it shifts, if you want, from an element of imprint, of footstep, or of architectural form in those terms, to one of mechanics. So it's the way it works that matters, not the way it is drawn. So that's also, I mean, this is also where Colas then goes with the Lear's New York and with the bigness. So this everything becomes a matter. So the the scale itself reached this critical mass, and things. It's not just a matter of enlarging or resizing, but things start to have their own autonomous functioning, and so it's always the way in which things start talking to each other. If you want, there starts to appear contracts between architectural parts. So, for instance, if you want the notion, I think of lobotomy that he points out with bigness and with the skyscraper. So the fact that there's this depth that is so big that the facade does not need to represent anymore what's inside. This is what he calls lobotomy, if I'm not mistaken. This is the lobotomy. What embodies is not a graphical kind of principle, but is almost a contract between inside and outside, or between actually plan and facade and an exterior elevation, which is there at work. So it doesn't provide a formal solution to architecture, but rather one that goes into a mechanics, if you want. So I don't know if I replied to your question.
Yes.
Somehow, good.
Good. If we're done with questions, first of all, once again, thank you, Riccardo, for this really rich, dense, large, and starry, I would say, lecture.
I hope not too cryptic.
No, I think it was not easy, but I think there are many things that, because they come from a background that you had, that is not easy at the first sight, I'd say. But I think for me it was not cryptic. It was dense, complex, but you were a good navigator, a good GPS in driving us around. And I think it was really also crucial in a way to have your intervention, because to me it has always the strength to offer many ways of looking at what we're doing from a different angle, which is extremely enriching for me, and I'm sure also for you and for the exam that will be somehow exclusive moment of this course. So once again, thank you. We meet on the 8th. We have a lecture from Agostino Barca on the 8th. And we will also spend 30 minutes more or less of lecture, will be 1 hour and a half, and we will have 30 minutes of explanation and illustration, let's say, of what we would expect from let's call it pilot. Besides that, Merry Christmas and happy holidays and Happy New Year.